The case of the Isdal woman. Our first story begins in what the locals of Bergen, Norway call Death Valley. The Isdalen Valley is a place of stark, remote beauty, a landscape of dark trees and cold stone that has long been a whispered about site of medieval suicides and modern-day hiking accidents. It is a fittingly somber stage for a mystery that has baffled investigators for over half a century, a mystery that begins and ends with a woman who, to this day, has no name. On the afternoon of November 29th, 1970, a university professor and his two young daughters were hiking in the valley when they noticed a strange, acrid smell on the wind, like burnt cloth. Following the scent, they moved off the main trail and discovered a horrifying scene. Tucked between a cluster of rocks was the partially burned body of a woman. She was lying on her back, her arms raised in a pugilistic pose, a grimly common reaction of muscles contracting in intense heat. The front of her body and her clothing were scorched, but her back was untouched. The scene was still, silent, and deeply unsettling. Local police were called, and from the moment they arrived, the case began to spiral into a labyrinth of contradictions. The woman was unidentified, and it seemed as though she, or someone else, had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it that way. All the labels on her clothing had been meticulously cut off. There were no identifying marks on her body, and no purse, wallet, or papers of any kind were found at the scene. There was a bottle of St. Olvard liqueur, a popular Norwegian brand, 2 plastic water bottles, a tube of sleeping pills, though most were accounted for, a silver spoon, and perhaps strangest of all, a fur hat that had been bought from a high-end store in Italy. But even these clues were dead ends. Police managed to find partial fingerprints on one of the water bottles, but they matched no records in Norway or with Interpol. The autopsy only deepened the puzzle. The coroner determined that the woman had died from a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning, meaning she was alive when the fire started, and an overdose of phenobarbital, a powerful sedative. Soot was found in her lungs, confirming she had breathed in the smoke. Yet, the amount of sleeping pills in her system wasn't necessarily a lethal dose on its own. The cause of death was ruled a probable suicide, but the circumstances screamed otherwise. Why would someone go to such lengths to erase their identity, travel to a remote valley, and then set themselves on fire? Many investigators on the case felt that suicide was an easy answer to an impossibly complex question. The first major break in the case came a few days later, when 2 suitcases belonging to the woman were discovered in a luggage locker at the Bergen railway station. Investigators pried them open, hoping to finally find her name, a passport, a letter, anything that would tell them who she was. Instead, they found a puzzle box. The suitcases contained a collection of fashionable clothing, several wigs and pairs of non-prescription glasses, and a tube of eczema cream. Though the prescription label had been peeled off, they also found a notepad with pages filled with what appeared to be a code. This is where the story shifts from a tragic death to a potential spy thriller. The coded notes, when eventually deciphered by Norwegian intelligence, turned out to be a record of the places she had visited. The woman was a phantom, a professional traveler who moved across Europe with ease. Police discovered she had stayed in at least 9 different hotels in Norway under 9 different aliases. Names like Finella Lork, Claudia Tielt, and Genevieve Lancière. She spoke multiple languages, including German, French, Flemish, and English, often with a slight accent that no one could quite place. She frequently changed her appearance using the wigs and glasses, and according to hotel staff, she was always elegant, always reserved, and always alone. The investigation became a Europe-wide manhunt for a ghost. Who was this woman? The most prominent theory, one that persists to this day, is that the Isdal woman was a spy operating during the height of the Cold War. Her meticulous efforts to hide her identity, her coded messages, and her constant travel are all hallmarks of espionage. In the 1970s, Norway was a strategic location for NATO and was known to be a place where both Soviet and Israeli intelligence agencies were active. Some have speculated she was a Mossad agent, others a KGB operative. Perhaps a mission went wrong, or maybe her cover was blown, and she was eliminated by her enemies, or even her own side, with her death staged to look like a suicide. Another theory suggests she was involved in something less political, but equally dangerous. She could have been a high-end courier, a smuggler, or connected to an international criminal organization. Perhaps she was a high-class escort who catered to powerful men and learned a secret she wasn't supposed to know. Decades passed. The case files were closed and reopened. In 2017, advances in technology allowed for new tests. Isotope analysis on her teeth revealed she was likely born around 1930, probably in or near Nuremberg, Germany, and had moved to the region of France, or the France-Germany border as a child. This was the first real clue to her origins in nearly 50 years, but it still didn't provide a name. The ghost now had a vague geography, but she remained a phantom. The case of the Isdal woman is so enduring because it is a perfect vacuum of identity. It's a story where every clue only leads to more questions. Was she a spy who paid the ultimate price, a criminal on the run, or simply a profoundly lonely woman who decided to erase herself from the world in the most enigmatic way possible? The cold ground of Death Valley holds the answer, and it has kept its secret for a very long time. The disappearance of the Sodder children. For most families, Christmas Eve is a time of warmth, anticipation, and comfort. It's a night meant for creating memories that will last a lifetime. For the Sodder family of Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Christmas Eve of 1945 would also create a memory, but it would be a haunting and fractured one. A memory that would launch one of the most perplexing and heartbreaking mysteries of the 20th century. George and Jenny Sodder, an Italian-American couple, had built a comfortable life and a large, bustling family, but by the time the sun rose on Christmas morning, their home would be a pile of smoldering ash, and 5 of their children would be gone. The night began with festive cheer. 9 of the 10 Sodder children were home that evening. The older kids, excited by new toys their sister Marion had bought them, convinced their mother to let them stay up late. Jenny agreed, and as the younger children went to bed, she retired to her own room around 10 p.m. with her husband George, who had already fallen asleep. The house settled into a quiet, peaceful state. The first crack in that peace came shortly after midnight. The phone rang, jolting Jenny awake. On the other end of the line was a woman whose voice she didn't recognize, asking for a name she didn't know. Jenny told the caller she had the wrong number and hung up, noticing, as she did, that the lights were still on and the front door was unlocked. She assumed the older kids had forgotten in their excitement. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and returned to bed, only to be awakened again, about an hour later, by a strange sound, a loud thump on the roof, followed by what sounded like something rolling down. She dismissed it and drifted back to sleep. At around 1:30 a.m. she woke for the third and final time, not to a sound, but to the smell of smoke. The room was thick with it. George's office was on fire. She woke him and the older children, and they all scrambled out of the burning house. In the frantic confusion, they did a head count. 9 children had been in the house that night. Only 4 of them were standing outside in the freezing cold. 5 were still trapped inside, in the upstairs bedrooms. 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty. What followed was not just a tragedy, but a series of impossibly timed and bizarre failures that prevented any chance of rescue. George Sodder rushed to grab the heavy wooden ladder he always kept, propped against the side of the house, his only way to reach the upstairs windows, but the ladder was gone. It had vanished from its usual spot. His next thought was to drive one of his 2 large coal trucks up to the house and climb on top of it. He ran to the trucks, but neither would start, despite having worked perfectly the day before. The engines were dead. Frantic, the family tried to call the fire department from a neighbor's house, as their own phone line was inexplicably dead. Someone had to drive into town to find the fire chief personally. But even then, the response was shockingly slow. The Fayetteville Fire Department, a small all-volunteer service, was undermanned, and the chief couldn't drive the fire engine himself. He had to wait for other firefighters to arrive. By the time the fire truck finally reached the Sodder home at 8 a.m., 7 hours after the fire had started, there was nothing left to save. The house had collapsed into its basement, leaving only a smoking pile of ash and timber. The official conclusion came quickly. The fire was ruled an accident caused by faulty wiring, and the 5 missing children, it was determined, had tragically perished in the blaze. It was a neat and tidy explanation for a horrifying event, but for George and Jenny Sodder, it was an explanation that made no sense. And the more they looked, the more the official story unraveled. The first and most glaring issue was the complete lack of remains. Despite sifting through the ashes for days, investigators found not a single bone, not a shred of flesh, nothing to indicate that 5 children had been cremated there. The fire chief suggested the blaze had been hot enough to completely destroy the bodies, but the Sodders knew this was unlikely. Jenny, who had lost a brother to a house fire, knew that bones often remained. Furthermore, household fires rarely reach the Tarrare degree temperatures for over 2 hours required for a full cremation, and many of the family's metal appliances were found in the rubble, warped but recognizable. If the fire couldn't melt steel, how could it have vaporized 5 entire skeletons? This was the starting point of the Sodders' lifelong investigation. They began to piece together the strange events leading up to that night. A telephone repairman confirmed their phone line had been cut, not burned. The missing ladder was found discarded down a nearby embankment. A witness claimed to have seen a man at the fire scene, stealing a block and tackle from their property. Another local woman reported seeing the children themselves, peering out of a passing car while the house was burning. George Sodder came to believe the fire was not an accident, but a deliberately set arson, designed as a cover for a kidnapping. He had been an outspoken critic of the Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini, which had led to heated arguments within the local Italian immigrant community. He recalled a traveling insurance salesman who, after being rebuffed, had warned him that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed because of his anti-Mussolini remarks. For the rest of their lives, George and Jenny Sodder dedicated themselves to finding their children. In 1952, they erected a large billboard on Route 16 with photos of the 5 children and a reward for information. It became a permanent, heartbreaking landmark. Their hopes were briefly ignited in 1967 when Jenny received a letter in the mail containing a photograph of a young man in his 20s who bore a striking resemblance to their son Louis. On the back, a cryptic message read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ill boys," and I know. The family hired a private investigator to look into the lead, but he took their money and was never heard from again. George Sodder passed away in 1969, and Jenny in 1989. They went to their graves without knowing what happened to their children, though they never gave up the belief that they were still alive somewhere. The billboard, a testament to a family's undying hope and an enduring mystery, stayed up until shortly after Jenny's death. To this day, the fate of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder remains unknown. Story of 5 smiling faces that vanished into the smoke of a long-ago Christmas fire. The mystery of the Voynich manuscript. In the Voynich rare book and manuscript library at Yale University, kept under carefully controlled conditions of light and humidity, lies a book. It is not the largest book in the library, nor the most beautifully decorated, but it is, without a doubt, the most mysterious. It is a book that has been seen by thousands, studied by the world's most brilliant minds, yet it has never been read. This is the story of the Voynich manuscript, a puzzle box of vellum and ink that has held its secrets for 600 years. At a glance, the manuscript seems to be a sort of medieval encyclopedia or alchemical text. It consists of about 240 vellum pages, filled with elegant flowing script and hundreds of intricate, hand-colored drawings. But as you look closer, an impenetrable weirdness begins to set in. The script, now known as Voynich, corresponds to no known language. It is an alphabet of graceful, alien-like characters that flow across the page with an unnerving confidence, as if the author knew exactly what they were saying. And then there are the illustrations. They are divided into what appear to be 6 distinct sections, each more bizarre than the last. The first and largest section is a botanical guide, but the plants it depicts are a botanist's nightmare. While some seem to be composites of real-world flora, the roots of one plant, the leaves of another, many are fantastical creations that have never grown on Earth. The manuscript then moves into astronomy and astrology, with intricate circular diagrams of suns, moons, and stars. Some resemble zodiacal constellations, but they are twisted into unfamiliar patterns, populated by strange symbols instead of the familiar archer or scorpion. Following this is perhaps the most famous and baffling section, often called the biological or balneological pages. Here, small, naked female figures, simply drawn, are shown bathing in pools and elaborate, interconnected tubs. They interact with strange organ-like plumbing, and the liquid they are submerged in is often a strange green or black. The purpose of these diagrams is a complete unknown. The book continues with cosmological charts, depictions of plant parts next to apothecary jars, and finally, a section of dense text broken up by star-like bullet points, thought to be recipes or instructions. Every single page is a question mark. It is a world unto itself, governed by a logic that remains completely out of our reach. For centuries, the world's greatest codebreakers have thrown themselves at the Voynich manuscript, and all have failed. During World War II, top cryptographers from the team that broke the German Enigma code tried their hand at it and made no progress. Modern computer analysis has confirmed that the script is not random gibberish. It obeys sophisticated linguistic rules. Words are repeated in patterns, consistent with a real language. Certain characters appear more frequently than others, and some letters seem to only appear at the beginning or end of words. It has all the statistical hallmarks of a genuine language, but it is a language that so far only one person has ever been able to read. The manuscript's known history only adds to its mystique. Radiocarbon dating places its creation somewhere between 1404 and 1438. Its story picks up in the late 16th century at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II in Prague. The emperor, a known collector of oddities and occult objects, was said to have purchased it for a massive sum, believing it to be the lost work of the 13th century polymath Roger Bacon. From there, it passed through the hands of alchemists and scholars before ending up in the possession of the Jesuits in Rome, where it sat, largely forgotten for 2 centuries. It was rediscovered in 1912 by a Polish rare book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich, who dedicated the rest of his life to solving its puzzle and ultimately gave the manuscript its modern name. So, what is it? The theories are as strange as the book itself. The most straightforward explanation is that it's a known language, perhaps a dialect from northern Italy, or even a form of Hebrew, written in an incredibly complex substitution cipher. The problem is that every attempt to decode it, from the simplest to the most complex, has failed to produce a coherent text. This leads to the second major theory, that the Voynich manuscript is nothing more than an elaborate and brilliant hoax. The idea is that a clever forger created the book in the 15th or 16th century specifically to sell it to a wealthy and gullible collector like Emperor Rudolf II. They simply invented a complex-looking alphabet and drew bizarre pictures to create the illusion of lost knowledge. The primary argument against the hoax theory is the sheer linguistic complexity of the text. To create pages of gibberish that so perfectly mimic the statistical patterns of a real language would be an act of genius in itself, arguably more difficult than creating a simple code. A third, more esoteric theory suggests the book is a work of outsider art. Perhaps it was created by a religious mystic, a visionary, or someone experiencing glossolalia, the phenomenon of speaking in tongues. In this view, The book is not a message meant to be read by others, but the direct transcription of a deeply personal, spiritual, or psychological state. It is a map of an internal world, and we were never meant to have the key. Today, the Voynich manuscript remains one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles. It is a perfect enigma, a text without a context, a language without a speaker, and a key without a lock. It sits silently behind glass at Yale, challenging every person who sees it with the same fundamental question: is this the key to a universe of forgotten knowledge? Or is it simply the most beautiful and elaborate piece of nonsense ever created? The Valentic incident. The sky at dusk is a place of transition, a lonely space between the certainty of the day and the deep mystery of the night. For a solo pilot, it can be a place of profound peace or profound isolation. On the evening of October 21st, 1978, for a young Australian pilot named Frederick Valentic, it would become the stage for his final act, a mystery documented in real time, broadcast over the radio, and then silenced forever. Frederick Valentic was just 20 years old, a relatively new pilot with about 50 hours of flight time. He was known to have a keen interest in UFOs, a detail that would later be scrutinized from every possible angle. That evening, he was making a routine 225-mile training flight in a single-engine Cessna 182L, flying from Melbourne, Australia, over the open water of the Bass Strait toward King Island. It was a clear night with calm winds and excellent visibility, perfect flying conditions. At 7:06 p.m., Valentic contacted Melbourne's air traffic control to report his position. The conversation was routine, the kind that happens thousands of times a day between pilots and the ground. But what happened next was anything but. Valentic's calm, professional tone shifted to one of confusion and then of palpable alarm. He asked the controller, Steve Roby, if there was any other known aircraft traffic in the area below 5,000 feet. Roby replied, "No known traffic." Valentic paused, then responded, "It seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000. It's got 4 bright lights. They seem to me like landing lights." For the next 6 minutes, the world was given a chilling, blow-by-blow account of an impossible encounter. Valentic described the object moving at high speed, passing 1,000 feet directly over his own aircraft, before circling back. He told Roby he was trying to identify it, but its speed was difficult to gauge. The controller, grounded miles away, could only listen, unable to see anything on his radar. Valentic Strickham's grew stranger. He said, "It seems to me that he's playing some sort of game. He's flying over me 2-3 times at a time, at speeds I could not identify." The controller pressed him for details, asking him to describe the aircraft. Valentic's reply became one of the most famous and debated phrases in the history of aviation mysteries. "It's not an aircraft," he said, his voice strained. He described it as having a long shape, a green light, and a shiny metallic exterior. The tension in his voice was rising. "It's hovering and it's not an aircraft," he repeated, a statement of pure, baffled certainty. The object, he claimed, had vanished for a moment, only to reappear on his left side. He reported that his own plane's engine was beginning to run rough, coughing and sputtering. And then came the final, terrifying moments of the transmission. Steve Roby, the controller, asked again for Valentic to identify the object. The last words Frederick Valentic ever spoke were, "My intentions are to go to King Island, Melbourne. That strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again. It is hovering, and it's not an aircraft." Following that last sentence, the microphone remained open for 17 seconds. There were no more words, just a strange, jarring noise, later described by investigators as a series of harsh, metallic, scraping sounds. Then abrupt and total silence. Air traffic control tried to re-establish contact, but there was no reply. A massive air and sea search was launched, covering over 1,000 square miles. For 4 days, planes and ships combed the Bass Strait. They found nothing, no wreckage, no oil slick, Not a single trace of Frederick Valentic or his Cessna. It was as if the sky had simply swallowed them whole. The official investigation concluded that the reason for the disappearance could not be determined, leaving the door wide open for theories. The most obvious and most sensational is that Valentic was telling the literal truth. Proponents of this theory believe he had a genuine encounter with a non-identified flying object, which either caused his plane to malfunction and crash, or abducted both him and his aircraft from the sky. This theory was bolstered by a handful of witnesses on the ground near the coast, who later came forward, claiming to have seen a strange, erratically moving green light in the sky that very night. The primary skeptical explanation is that Valentic, a pilot with limited experience flying over open water at night, fell victim to spatial disorientation. This is a dangerous state where a pilot can lose all sense of up and down, sometimes even flying upside down, without realizing it. In this disoriented state, the 4 bright lights he saw could have been the reflections of his own plane's lights on the dark, glassy surface of the water, which he mistook for another craft. The metallic scraping sounds at the end of the transmission could have been the sound of his plane breaking apart upon impact with the sea. Other, less likely theories have been proposed. Some suggest he staged his own disappearance, though no evidence supports this, and he has never reappeared. Others believe he encountered a conventional but undeclared aircraft, perhaps on a smuggling run, and simply misidentified it in the darkness. But this fails to account for the bizarre maneuvers he described, or the final, chilling sounds. Ultimately, we are left with nothing but a recording, an audio document of a man's final moments, describing something he could not comprehend. We can analyze the words, debate the science, and question the source, but we cannot escape the unnerving reality of what the tape captured. Was Frederick Valentic a victim of his own inexperience, or a credible witness to an event that defies our understanding of the world? The transmission has ended, but the mystery continues, resonating in that final, haunting, metallic sound. The dancing plague of history is filled with plagues, plagues of disease, of famine, of war. But in the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg, in modern-day France, was struck by a plague so bizarre, so utterly strange, that it sounds more like a dark fairy tale than a historical event. It was a plague that didn't bring sores or fever, but an irresistible, uncontrollable, and ultimately deadly urge to dance. It all began in July with a single person. A woman named Frau Troffea stepped out of her home and onto the cobblestone street. Without any music, and with a seemingly blank expression on her face, she began to dance. It was not a dance of joy or celebration. It was a frantic, silent, and feverish shuffling and twirling that continued for hours, until she collapsed from exhaustion. After a brief rest, she would rise and begin again. Her husband and neighbors watched in bewilderment and alarm. This solo performance continued, day after day, for nearly a week. What began as a strange personal episode soon became a public crisis. By the end of that first week, a few dozen other citizens of Strug had joined Frau Troffea. They too were compelled by this invisible force, dancing in the streets with the same frantic, involuntary energy. There was no shared music, no common rhythm, just a collection of individuals locked in their own private, desperate marathon. Within a month, the number of dancers had swelled to a staggering 400. The city was in the grip of a full-blown epidemic. The city's elite, its physicians, councilmen, and guild leaders were completely baffled. After consulting with one another, they ruled out any astrological or supernatural causes. Their diagnosis, based on the limited medical knowledge of the time, was that the dancers were suffering from hot blood. It was a natural disease, they concluded, caused by an overheating of the humors in the brain, and their prescribed cure was, by modern standards, disastrously wrong. They decided the victims needed to dance the fever out. Instead of prescribing rest, the authorities facilitated more dancing. They cleared out the city's large guild halls to serve as dance floors. They constructed a massive wooden stage in the middle of the grain market, And to top it all off, they hired professional musicians to play pipes, drums, and horns, providing a constant, driving beat to encourage the afflicted. The intention was to help the dancers burn off their manic energy until they were cured. The result, however, was a grotesque spectacle of public suffering. The constant music and the official endorsement of the dancing only seemed to fuel the hysteria, possibly encouraging more psychologically suggestible people to join the ranks. For the dancers themselves, it was a death sentence. Under the hot August sun, they danced until their feet were bloody and their bodies were bruised. Historical accounts describe them crying out in pain, begging for help, all while their limbs continued to move against their will. They were not celebrating. They were trapped. At the peak of the plague, it's reported that as many as 15 people per day were dying from sheer exhaustion, strokes, and heart attacks. Finally realizing their prescribed cure was only making things worse, the city authorities abruptly changed course. They banned all public music and dancing. The dancers, many of whom were now weak and delirious, were rounded up and transported to a mountain shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a Catholic saint who was, ironically, believed to have the power to cure dancing-related ailments. There, they were made to pray for absolution. Slowly, over the next few weeks, the compulsive movement subsided. The dancing plague of 15, but the question remains, what on earth caused it? For many years, the leading scientific theory was ergot poisoning. Ergot is a type of mold that grows on damp rye, a staple grain used for making bread. This mold contains psychoactive compounds that can cause severe muscle spasms, convulsions, and hallucinations. However, most modern historians have now discounted this theory. While ergot can cause spasms, it is unlikely to produce the coordinated, sustained, and complex movements of dancing for days on end. Furthermore, ergot poisoning typically restricts blood flow to the extremities, making such an athletic feat almost impossible. The most widely accepted explanation today is a phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness, or more commonly, mass hysteria. The citizens of Strasbourg in 1518 were living under unimaginable psychological stress. They had just endured a series of brutal famines, and diseases like syphilis and leprosy were rampant. Poverty and desperation were a part of daily life. The theory suggests that this extreme, prolonged stress created a kind of psychological tinderbox. Frau Troffea's strange dance may have been the spark that lit the flame. In a deeply superstitious culture, where people believed in divine curses and demonic possession, the sight of one person's affliction could have acted as a powerful trigger for others who were already at their breaking point. In this view, the dancing plague was a collective nervous breakdown, a physical manifestation of a community's shared trauma. It was a plague not of a virus, but of the mind itself. The authorities' disastrous decision to encourage the dancing would have only reinforced the belief that this was a real, physical ailment, creating a feedback loop that made the hysteria spread even faster. It's a chilling reminder that the mind, when pushed to its absolute limit, can exert a terrifying and powerful control over the body, a power that can, in the strangest of ways, become deadly. The Lake City Quiet Pills mystery. Mysteries are no longer confined to dusty archives or the cold case files of a police precinct. In the 21st century, some of the deepest and most disturbing rabbit holes exist in the digital ether, buried in the comment sections of forgotten websites and the post histories of anonymous users. This is one such story. It's a mystery that begins with the death of one man and spirals into a potential global conspiracy, a puzzle box of coded language and digital ghosts sewn as Lake City Quiet Pills. Our story begins in 2016 with the real-world death of a man named Angel Santana. Online, Santana was known by the username Religion of Peace, an eccentric but apparently well-liked moderator of several subreddits, including one for selling firearms. When news of his death from a stroke was announced on Reddit, the community mourned. But for a few curious users, his death became the starting point for an investigation that would uncover one of the internet's most baffling and sinister mysteries. Digging through Santana's old posts, a group of online sleuths discovered something completely out of place. Tucked away on job-seeking subreddits were a series of bizarre and vaguely worded employment listings he had posted. The ads were looking for hosts in Lake City, Florida, for an organization that was never named. The job descriptions were a masterclass in cryptic language. They required discretion, an ability to handle diverse cultural backgrounds, and experience with maritime cargo. The pay was exceptionally high for such an ill-defined role, and the ads were littered with strange acronyms. One of these acronyms, LCQP, led them to a website, LakeCityQuietPills.com. The site itself was a relic of the early internet, a simple, stark page with a repeating skull logo and nothing more than a single email address for contact. It was here that the online investigators made their first dark interpretation, one that would define the entire mystery. Lake City Quiet Pills. They theorized it wasn't a reference to medicine, it was a euphemism. Quiet pills, they believed, meant bullets. And the job was not for a host but for a hitman. What followed was a frantic, collaborative deep dive into every corner of Angel Santana's digital life. The sleuths began to piece together a narrative, a potential conspiracy that was both wildly outlandish and chillingly plausible. They found posts where Santana mentioned a supposed boss, a shadowy figure he called Milo, who was described as a former US military man and the true mastermind of the operation. The puzzle pieces grew darker. An image file, allegedly linked to the group, was unearthed. It appeared to be a manifesto or a work ledger. On it was a list of names, locations spanning the globe, from India to the United Kingdom, and cryptic codes like L1 and L2 next to them. The immediate conclusion drawn by the community was that this was a hit list, a schedule of targets for this supposed organization. The working theory that emerged on Reddit was this: Lake City Quiet Pills was the public-facing name for a decentralized, online-managed ring of mercenaries or assassins. They took contracts from unknown clients to eliminate targets around the world, and they used the seemingly open forums of Reddit as a bizarre and deniable recruitment tool. The coded language was their way of communicating in plain sight, filtering for the right kind of applicant, while appearing as nonsense to everyone else. Angel Santana, they theorized, was not just some guy on Reddit. He was a mid-level manager or dispatcher for this deadly organization. Even his death, officially from a stroke, was re-examined through a paranoid lens. Had he become a liability? Was he silenced by the very people he worked for? Of course, this is just one interpretation, the most sensational one. The truth of Lake City Quiet Pills is likely buried in nuance, and several other theories have been proposed. The most compelling alternative is that it was all an elaborate alternate reality game, or ARG. An ARG is a type of interactive fiction that uses the real world as its platform. In this scenario, Angel Santana was a storyteller, a puppet master, who created a fictional world of spies and assassins for others to play along with. The cryptic website, the coded job ads, the hit list, it was all part of an immersive game. The primary evidence for this theory is the sheer absurdity of recruiting for a secret assassination ring on a public forum like Reddit. It seems too reckless to be real. Other theories are less complex. Perhaps it was a government honeypot, a fake organization set up by an intelligence agency to lure in and identify potential criminals. Or maybe the simplest explanation is the truest, that Angel Santana was just an eccentric and perhaps troubled man with a vivid imagination, and the entire Lake City Quiet Pills universe was his own private fantasy world. In this view, a community of online sleuths, grieving and intrigued by his death, simply found patterns in the chaos and built a conspiracy where none existed. The trail has since gone cold, the website is long gone, and the key players are either dead or have vanished back into the anonymity of the internet. We are left with a ghost story for the digital age. Was it a real-life assassination market, operating in the open, a complex game that blurred the lines with reality, or just the strange final project of a lonely man. The ambiguity is what makes the mystery so unsettling. It's a reminder that in the infinite archives of the internet, you can sometimes find things that stare back from the darkness. The legend of the Green Children of Woolpit. In our search for mystery, we often look to the modern world, to cold cases and digital phantoms. But some of the most profound and unsettling mysteries are those that have echoed down through the centuries. Stories from a time when the lines between the real world and the world of myth were thin and porous. This is one such story, a legend from 12th century England, from a small village named Woolpit. It's the story of two lost children who were found crying in a field, speaking a language no one understood, and whose skin was the color of fresh spring leaves. The tale was recorded by two separate and respected chroniclers of the time, Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh. They tell us that during the reign of King Stephen, on a hot day during the harvest, the villagers of Woolpit were reaping their fields near a series of ancient trenches known as the Wolf Pits. It was there, emerging from one of the ditches, that they found a young boy and his slightly older sister. The children were weeping, clearly distressed and disoriented, but it was their appearance that stunned the villagers into silence. Their clothes were made of a strange, unfamiliar fabric, but stranger still was the color of their skin. It was, by all accounts, vividly and unnervingly green. The bewildered children were taken to the home of a local landowner, Sir Richard de Cowan. For days, they refused to eat any of the food that was offered to them, seeming to starve themselves despite the bounty placed before them. The breakthrough came when servants brought in freshly harvested broad beans. Upon seeing the green pods, the children fell upon them, eating them raw and eagerly. For a long time, it was the only food they would consume. No one could understand their language. It was a torrent of alien sounds and syllables that matched no known dialect. But over time, as they were cared for, they slowly began to learn English. The boy, who was younger and had appeared sickly from the start, grew weaker and died shortly after he and his sister were baptized. The girl, however, proved more resilient. She adapted to her new life and began to eat other foods, like bread, and as her diet changed, a strange transformation occurred. The green hue of her skin began to fade, eventually settling into a normal, healthy complexion. Once she could communicate fluently, the villagers finally asked her the question that had been burning in their minds. Who was she, and where on earth did she and her brother come from? Her answer only deepened the mystery. She claimed they were from a place called St. Martin's Land. It was, she described, a subterranean world, a place of perpetual twilight, where the sun never fully rose. In their land, she said, all the inhabitants were green, just as they had been. One day, she and her brother were herding their father's cattle when they heard a loud, captivating sound, like the ringing of bells. Drawn by the noise, they followed it into a cavern. They wandered through the darkness for a long time, until they were suddenly blinded by a brilliant light. When their eyes adjusted, they found themselves in the harvest fields of Woolpit, terrified and alone. The girl grew into a woman, assimilated into the village, and was apparently known for being, as one chronicler put it, rather loose and wanton in her conduct. She eventually married a man from the nearby town of King's Lynn, and there the historical record of her life ends, but the legend was just beginning. So, what is the truth behind this incredible story? The simplest explanation is that it's nothing more than a folk tale. It has all the classic elements of a fairy story: lost children, a magical otherworld, and a journey between realities. It may have been a local legend, but the two chroniclers, living in a deeply superstitious age, recorded as fact. But another, more compelling set of theories suggests the story is based on a real event, one that was simply misinterpreted by the medieval mind. The children could have been the orphans of Flemish immigrants. At the time, there was a community of Flemish weavers and merchants in the area who faced brutal persecution. The children could have been fleeing violence, speaking a language Flemish, that the villagers of Woolpit didn't recognize, and wearing clothes that seemed foreign to them. But what about their green skin? This too may have a rational explanation. A severe type of anemia, once known as chlorosis, or the green sickness, can give a person's skin a noticeable greenish tint. This condition is caused by extreme dietary deficiency. It's plausible that two malnourished, orphaned children, lost and wandering in the dense Thetford forest nearby, could have developed this condition. Their story of a twilight land could simply be a child's confused memory of being lost under the dark, dense canopy of the forest for a long time. Their diet of only raw beans could be because it was the first familiar, edible food they had seen after a period of starvation. Of course, more modern speculative theories have been put forward, suggesting the children were aliens or beings from a subterranean hollow earth. These ideas, while popular in paranormal circles, are dismissed by historians, but they speak to the enduring, otherworldly power of the legend. Whether it's a fairy tale, a distorted piece of history, or something else entirely, the story of the Green Children of Woolpit has captivated people for nearly 1,000 years. It's a perfect medieval mystery, a haunting image of two lost children who seemingly stepped out of another world and into our own, leaving us forever to wonder about the land of perpetual twilight from which they came. The Gardner Museum heist. Some treasures are lost to time, buried in shipwrecks or the ruins of ancient cities. Others are lost to greed. In the early morning hours of March 18, 1990, in Boston, a pair of thieves disguised as police officers walked into a museum and over the course of 8 pulled off the single largest property theft in the history of the world. They vanished with over $500 million worth of art, leaving behind only empty frames and a mystery that has haunted the art world for over 3 decades. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is not like other museums. It's a Venetian-style palace, a deeply personal and somewhat eccentric collection of art amassed by the woman whose name it bears. Her will stipulated that nothing in the collection could ever be permanently changed. That stubborn devotion to permanence would soon become a poignant, daily reminder of an irreplaceable loss. The night of the heist was the day after St. Patrick's Day, a time of celebration in Boston. At 1:24 a.m., a fire alarm panel buzzed at the museum's security desk. 2 men in what appeared to be official Boston police uniforms were at the door, claiming they were responding to a report of a disturbance. One of the 2 night guards, a young rock musician named Rick Abath, made a fateful decision. Breaking protocol, he let them in. The takedown was swift and professional. One of the fake officers told Abath he looked familiar and that there was a warrant out for his arrest, ordering him to step away from the security desk and its panic button. Abath complied. He and the second guard were quickly subdued, bound with duct tape and led down to the museum's basement, where they were handcuffed to pipes. They were unharmed, but they would remain there, helpless, for the next 7 hours. The thieves now had the entire museum to themselves. For the next 81 minutes, they moved through the quiet, darkened galleries with a strange mix of purpose and clumsiness. They were not sophisticated art thieves. They were smash-and-grab robbers in a palace of wonders. They walked past priceless works by Titian and Raphael, instead heading to the Dutch room. There, they crudely sliced 2 of the most valuable paintings from their frames: Rembrandt's only known seascape, The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, and his A Lady and Gentleman in Black. They also took another masterpiece, Johannes Vermeer's The Concert, a painting so rare it is one of only about 34 known Vermeers in the world, and is considered the most valuable stolen object of any kind. Their choices were baffling. They took a small Monet painting from a different gallery, 5 drawings by Degas, and an ancient Chinese bronze beaker. They spent a significant amount of time trying to unscrew the frame of a large Napoleonic flag, but eventually gave up, leaving it behind. They made 2 separate trips to their car to load their loot, and then, as the city slept, they drove off into the night, taking the security tapes with them. They had vanished without a trace. The crime wasn't discovered until the morning shift arrived, and found the guards still tied up in the basement. The FBI was called in, and one of the largest art crime investigations in history began. But the trail was cold from the start. The thieves had left behind no fingerprints, no clues to their identities. In a heartbreaking tribute, and in accordance with Isabella Stewart Gardner's will, the empty frames of the stolen masterpieces were returned to their original spots on the museum walls. They hang there to this day, ghostly rectangles of empty space serving as placeholders for a return that may never come. A reward of $10 million for information leading to the art's recovery remains unclaimed. So who did it, and where is the art now? Over the decades, the investigation has pointed overwhelmingly in one direction: the Boston mob. The FBI is confident that the heist was carried out by a local crew with ties to the Patriarca crime family. While no one has ever been charged directly for the theft, a cast of suspects, almost all of whom are now deceased, has emerged. The prevailing theory is that a small-time gang of thieves, including men like George Reisfelder and David Turner, who fit the guards' descriptions, pulled off the robbery. They likely didn't understand the true value of what they were taking, only that it was important. They were not art connoisseurs. They were common criminals who got lucky. The plan was likely to sell the art or use it as a bargaining chip, perhaps to get a fellow mobster out of jail. But the heist was too perfect, too famous. The paintings instantly became the most wanted works of art on the planet, making them completely impossible to sell on any market, legitimate or black. They were, in effect, priceless and worthless at the same time. The trail then leads to figures like Carmelo Merlino, a mob boss who allegedly tried to broker the art's return from prison before he died, and Robert Gentile, a gangster whose property was repeatedly searched by the FBI, who believed until his death that he knew where the art was hidden. It's believed the art passed through several hands in the criminal underworld before its trail went completely cold. The key players all died, taking their secrets with them. The art was never a prize to be admired. It was a hot potato, a dangerous secret to be hidden. Is it now sitting in a climate-controlled vault, owned by a shadowy, anonymous collector? Or, as some investigators fear, was it damaged or destroyed by panicked criminals who didn't know how to care for it? Is it buried somewhere, waiting to be found, or has it been lost forever? The empty frames hang in silent vigil, waiting for an answer. The case of Tarrare. The annals of medical history are filled with strange and inexplicable cases, stories of individuals whose bodies defy all known science, but few are as singularly bizarre or as profoundly disturbing as the case of the 18th century Frenchman known only as Tarrare. He was not a giant, nor was he deformed in a typical way. Instead, he was a man afflicted with a condition that turned his life into a waking nightmare, a pathological, all-consuming, and seemingly infinite hunger. Born in rural France around 1772, Tarrare was, by all accounts, a walking paradox. As a teenager, he was of average height and remarkably thin, weighing only about 100 pounds. Yet, he could reportedly eat his own body weight in beef in a single day. His body was a study in grotesque anatomy. He had an abnormally wide mouth with heavily stained teeth and lips that were almost invisible. His skin was so loose and flaccid that when he hadn't eaten, he could wrap the fold of skin from his stomach entirely around his waist. When he had eaten, his belly would distend like a massive balloon. He was said to emit a foul odor so powerful it was unbearable from 20 paces away, and he would steam with sweat after every colossal meal. His appetite was so voracious that his parents, unable to support his needs, kicked him out of the house. He fell in with a traveling troupe of charlatans and thieves, becoming a street performer. His act was simple and shocking. He would eat anything the crowd offered him. He swallowed baskets of apples, corks, stones, and in a display of his horrifying capacity, was documented consuming whole animals, from eels to, on one occasion, a live cat. When the French Revolution began, Tarrare joined the army, but the meager military rations were like a drop of water on a bonfire. He was constantly starving, performing chores for other soldiers in exchange for their food and scavenging in gutters for any scrap of refuse. He was soon hospitalized for extreme exhaustion, where he came the attention of two prominent military surgeons, Dr. Corville and Baron Percy. They were fascinated. He was a man who defied biology. They performed experiments, offering him a meal intended for 15 people, which he devoured with ease, before immediately falling asleep. His unique ability gave the military a strange and unorthodox idea. Could Tarrare be a spy? To test the theory, they had him swallow a small wooden box containing a written message. 2 days later, he passed the box, its contents perfectly preserved. The experiment was a success. He was sent on a real mission to deliver a secret message to a captured French colonel in Prussia, disguised as a German peasant. Tarrare was captured almost immediately. He was flogged by the Prussians, but he never gave up the location of the box. Eventually, after a mock execution that left him deeply traumatized, he was released and sent back to the French lines, his career as a spy ending as quickly as it had begun. Broken by the experience, Tarrare returned to the hospital and begged Baron Percy to find a cure for his condition. The doctor tried everything he could think of: opium, wine vinegar, tobacco pills, and even filling his stomach with soft-boiled eggs. Nothing worked. Tarrare's hunger was a force of nature, and it began to drive him to desperate and horrifying acts. He was caught sneaking out of the hospital to fight with stray dogs over carrion in alleys. He was discovered drinking the blood that had been drained from other patients during bloodletting procedures. On several occasions, he was caught trying to enter the hospital morgue to eat the bodies of the dead. The hospital staff was horrified and demanded he be expelled. Baron Percy defended him, still believing his condition was a medical puzzle to be solved, not a moral failing. But then came the final, unforgivable incident. A 14-month-old toddler, the child of a hospital worker, vanished without a trace. While no direct proof was ever found, everyone immediately suspected Tarrare. The accusation, combined with his past behavior, was enough. He was driven from the hospital for good, a pariah to the medical world that had once been so fascinated by him. 4 years later, Baron Percy was contacted again. Tarrare was in a hospital in Versailles, gravely ill. He died shortly after, at the estimated age of just 26. From what was diagnosed as advanced tuberculosis, the doctors who performed the autopsy were met with a stench so overwhelming that they could not complete a full examination. But they did discover that his gullet was unnaturally wide, and when they looked inside his mouth, they could see a straight, open channel down into his stomach. His stomach itself was enormous, sagging and covered in ulcers, and his liver and gallbladder were abnormally large. The autopsy revealed the grotesque results of his condition, but not the cause. What was the source of Tarrare's unending hunger? Modern theories range from a damaged amygdala or hypothalamus in the brain to an extreme form of hyperthyroidism or a yet unknown genetic disorder. We will likely never know for sure. He remains a singular, tragic figure in medical history, not a monster, but a man whose own body was a prison, a man tormented by a physical need so profound and so powerful that it consumed not only everything around him, but ultimately himself. The ghost ship Carol A. Deering. The ocean is a keeper of secrets. For millennia it has swallowed ships and sailors, leaving behind nothing but whispers and legends. But no story is more unsettling than that of the ghost ship, a vessel found adrift, sails flapping in the wind, with no sign of its crew. On January 3rd, off the treacherous coast of North Carolina, one such vessel was found, giving rise to a mystery that would involve the US government, whispers of mutiny, and the dark lore of the Bermuda Triangle. This is the story of the Carol A. Deering. She was a magnificent sight, a 5-masted commercial schooner, one of the last great sailing ships of her kind. But when surfmen from the Cape Hatteras lifeboat station spotted her, she was a portrait of disaster. The Deering was hard aground on the Diamond Shoals, a notorious stretch of shifting sandbars, known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. Her sails were still set, and she was being battered by the waves. But a strange and eerie silence hung over her. She had been abandoned. When a boarding party was finally able to reach the wreck a few days later, the mystery deepened. The ship was utterly deserted. The 2 lifeboats were gone. The ship's logbook, the navigational equipment, the chronometer, and all of the crew's personal belongings had vanished. But in the ship's galley, an uneaten meal was found, laid out, as if the crew had been in the middle of preparing to eat, when something forced them to leave. Suddenly, and in great haste, the only life left on board was the ship's cat. An investigation, one of the largest of its time, was launched by the US government, involving 5 departments and led by the future president, Herbert Hoover. To understand what might have happened, they had to piece together the ship's troubled final voyage. The Deering had set sail from Virginia for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, with a cargo of coal. In Rio, the ship's experienced captain fell ill and was replaced by a 66-year-old retiree, Captain Willis Wormell. The new first mate was a man named Charles McClellan. It was a pairing that seemed doomed from the start. Captain Wormell was known to be a kind, easygoing man, perhaps too lax for the rough life at sea. McClellan, on the other hand, was a harsh and aggressive disciplinarian who quickly earned the contempt of the mostly Danish crew. On the return voyage, the tension simmered. At a stop in Barbados, McClellan got drunk, declared his hatred for the captain, and threatened to kill him before being arrested by local police. Captain Wormell, in a move that many saw as a fatal sign of weakness, bailed his first mate out and forgave him. The last time anyone heard from the Caroline Deering was on January 29, 1921. The ship hailed the Cape Lookout lightship in North Carolina. A man with a foreign accent, not an officer, spoke to the lightship's keeper. He reported that the ship had lost its anchors in a storm and asked the keeper to notify the company. But the keeper noted something else that was deeply unusual. The crew of the Deering were milling about on the foredeck, a part of the ship where they had no business being. They seemed disorganized, aimless. After that brief exchange, the Deering sailed on into the approaching dusk and vanished. So, what happened to the 10 men of her crew? The leading and most plausible theory is mutiny. The open conflict between the captain, the first mate, and the crew created a powder keg. It's believed that the crew, possibly led by the volatile first mate McClellan, or perhaps acting against both officers, took control of the ship. This would explain why an ordinary crewman was speaking to the lightship, and why the crew seemed to be gathered in an unusual part of the vessel. They may have murdered the officers, and then, after the ship ran aground, escaped in the lifeboats, only to be lost in the violent seas of the graveyard of the Atlantic. Another powerful theory centers on the unforgiving nature of the ocean itself. The area is infamous for sudden, violent storms. It's possible the ship was crippled by a hurricane, losing its anchors and rudder, as reported. Believing the ship was sinking, Captain Wormell could have given the order to abandon ship. The crew would have taken to the lifeboats, along with the logs and equipment, only to be overwhelmed and drowned by the same storm that drove their empty vessel onto the shoals. This theory is given more weight by the fact that another vessel, the steamship SS Hewitt, was in the same area and vanished at the exact same time, without a trace. Of course, given the location and the complete disappearance of the crew, the Carroll A. Deering quickly became a cornerstone of the Bermuda Triangle legend, with paranormal forces and mysterious phenomena blamed for its fate. Other, more fringe theories of the time even suggested hijacking by Soviet sympathizers or local pirates. The ship itself was eventually broken apart by the relentless waves and had to be destroyed with dynamite, taking its final secrets with it. We are left with a haunting image, a majestic ship, empty and broken, its crew gone, its final meal uneaten. Was their disappearance the result of a bloody human drama, or were they simply another casualty of the ocean's immense and indifferent power? The 10 men of the Carroll A. Deering never came home, and their ship remains one of history's most perfect and enduring ghost stories. The lead mask's case, Some mysteries are born from a lack of evidence, a trail gone cold. Others are born from an abundance of it, a collection of clues so bizarre, so seemingly unrelated, that they defy any logical explanation. On a hill overlooking the city of Tarrare, Brazil, one such scene was discovered in. It was a scene that involved formal suits, waterproof raincoats, a cryptic notebook, and two crude lead masks that have become the enduring symbol of this deeply strange and unsolved case. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, a young man was flying a kite on a remote hill known as Morro do Vintém when he stumbled upon a grim discovery. Lying on a carefully cleared patch of ground were the bodies of two men. They were laid out neatly, side by side. Both were dressed impeccably in formal suits and waterproof coats. There were no signs of a struggle, no bullet wounds, no obvious signs of violence at all. Beside them lay an empty water bottle and two small towels, and resting on their faces were the objects that would make this case infamous: two crude, spectacle-like masks hammered out of raw lead. The police were called, and the investigation began. The two men were soon identified as Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Che Viana, a pair of electronic technicians from a nearby town. They had left their homes 3 days earlier, on August's telling their families they were traveling to São Paulo to buy supplies for their business. They took with them a significant sum of money, but their journey had not taken them to the industrial hub of São Paulo. It had ended here, on this lonely hill. Investigators traced their final movements. The two men had taken a bus to Niterói. They were last seen alive at a local bar, where they purchased a bottle of water, presumably the same one found at the scene. A waitress at the bar later told police that one of the men, Miguel, seemed extremely nervous and was constantly checking his watch, as if he were running late for a critical appointment. The most important clue, however, was found in a small notebook lying with the bodies. In it was a set of bizarre and cryptic instructions, written in Portuguese. It read, 4:30 p.m. Be at the determined place, 6:30 p.m. Ingest capsules. After effect, protect metals, await signal mask. Below this were some technical notes about electronic components. This note transformed the case from a simple, unexplained death into a paranormal enigma. What capsules were they supposed to ingest? What effect were they expecting? Why did they need to protect metals? And what signal were they waiting for? And what was the purpose of the lead masks? The autopsy only deepened the confusion. By the time the men were found, their bodies were too badly decomposed for a thorough examination, a problem made worse by delays at the local morgue. The coroner was unable to determine a cause of death. Toxicology tests were performed, but no trace of any common poison was found. There was no sign of radiation. The men had, for all intents and purposes, simply died. This vacuum of certainty was quickly filled with theories, each more extraordinary than the last. The most popular and enduring theory is that the two men were involved in a UFO encounter. In the 1960s, Brazil was a hotbed of ufology and esoteric spiritualism. Proponents of this theory believe that Manuel and Miguel were followers of these beliefs, and that they ascended Vintém Hill for a pre-arranged meeting with extraterrestrials. The lead masks in this scenario were to protect their eyes from the brilliant light or radiation of the alien craft. The capsules might have been something they were instructed to take to prepare for contact, and the signal was the arrival of the UFO itself. In this version of events, the men died because the encounter went wrong, perhaps from a psychic shock, an energy weapon, or some other alien influence that left no trace. A more grounded but equally strange theory suggests the men were victims of their own spiritual experiment. The capsules they ingested could have been a powerful psychedelic or a misidentified poison, taken willingly as part of a ritual to achieve an out-of-body experience or a higher state of consciousness. Miguel's nervousness at the bar could have been the anxiety of a man about to undertake a profound and dangerous spiritual journey. Their deaths then would be an accidental overdose, a tragic end to a misguided quest for enlightenment. The third major theory is one of simple, worldly crime, cloaked in esoteric distraction. The two men went to the hill, not to meet aliens, but to meet other people for an illicit deal. Perhaps they were attempting to sell valuable electronic components, or even illegal radioactive material, which would explain the instruction to protect metals and the lead masks. In this scenario, the deal went bad. The other party poisoned the men with a substance that would be undetectable after days of decomposition, stole their money and their goods, and then arranged the scene with the masks and the note to look like a paranormal event, sending the police on a wild goose chase. We are left with a single bizarre snapshot in time. Two men, dressed for a formal occasion, lying dead on a hill, their faces covered by lead masks. Were they waiting for a spaceship? Were they seekers of spiritual truth who went too far? Or were they simply the victims of a clever and ruthless murder? The note they left behind feels like a page torn from the middle of a story we will never get to read. The lead masks, with their empty, sightless gaze, offer no answer, only a blank stare into the heart of one of Brazil's greatest unsolved mysteries. The final call of Brandon Swanson. There are few things more common, more mundane, than a phone call for help. A car stuck in a ditch, on a dark country road, a call to your parents, the reassuring sound of a voice on the other end of the line, promising that they are on their way. It's a scenario of temporary inconvenience, but on the night of May 14th, 2008, for a 19-year-old college student named Brandon Swanson, that familiar lifeline would become the final, terrifying record of his disappearance. It was a 47-minute conversation that ended with a single sudden curse, followed by an eternal silence. It was the last day of the spring semester at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, and Brandon Swanson was out celebrating with friends. After attending parties in two nearby towns, he began the drive home to Marshall, Minnesota, a route he knew well. But sometime after midnight, while navigating the rural backroads, his green Chevrolet Lumina slipped off the gravel and into a ditch. He wasn't hurt, and the car wasn't badly damaged, but he was stuck. So he did what any of us would do. At 1:54 a.m., he called his parents. Annette and Brian Swanson answered the phone to hear their son's voice, calm and untroubled. He told them what happened and said he thought he was somewhere near the town of Lind. They told him to stay put, got in their pickup truck, and headed out to find him, keeping him on the line the entire time. What followed was a strange and frustrating dance in the dark. His parents would drive to an intersection and flash their lights, but Brandon couldn't see them. He would yell and flash his own, but they saw nothing. For nearly half an hour, they were connected by voice, but completely disconnected by geography. Both parties grew frustrated. Finally, Brandon told his parents he was giving up on the car. He could see the lights of a town, what he believed was Lind, and he was just going to walk there. He told his dad to drive to a friend's house in Lind, and that he would meet them there. His father, Brian, stayed on the phone with him. As he began to walk, Brandon described his surroundings in the dark. He mentioned cutting through fields, passing fences, and hearing the sound of running water nearby. They talked, a father and son, for several more minutes, the call stretching to the 47-minute mark. And then, in the middle of a perfectly normal conversation, Brandon suddenly yelled, "Oh, shit!" The line went dead. Brian tried calling back immediately, again and again, but Brandon never answered. His parents continued to search for him throughout the night, honking their horn and shouting his name into the Minnesota darkness, but there was no response. The next morning, they officially reported him missing. The initial search was centered, naturally, on the area around Lind, based on what Brandon had told his parents. But search crews found nothing. There was no sign of Brandon, and more strangely, no sign of his car. The first major break in the case came later that day, and it was a chilling one. Using data from Brandon's cell phone, the sheriff's office was able to pinpoint the location of his final call. It wasn't near Lind at all. His abandoned car was found 25 miles away, near the town of Taunton. Brandon, a young man who grew up in the area, had been completely and utterly lost. This discovery reframed the entire mystery. The search immediately shifted to the rural farmland around his car. This was a landscape of vast fields, dotted with abandoned farmsteads, old wells, and numerous bodies of water. Search and rescue teams with scent-sniffing dogs were brought in. The dogs picked up Brandon's scent at his car and followed a trail that led away from the road, across a gravel path, and through open fields for nearly 3 miles. The trail followed the bank of the Yellow Medicine River for a stretch, and then, at a certain point, it simply stopped. The most widely accepted theory, the one held by law enforcement, and a conclusion his parents have reluctantly come to accept, is that Brandon's disappearance was a tragic accident. The scent trail leading to the river, his mention of hearing water on the phone, and his final, sudden exclamation, all point to one terrible possibility, that in the darkness, he stumbled and fell into the fast-flowing, frigid waters of the Yellow Medicine River. If he fell, the shock of the cold water could have incapacitated him in seconds, and the current would have quickly swept his body away, potentially for miles, making recovery almost impossible. The "oh shit" was not the sound of him meeting a person. It was the sound of him meeting the edge of the riverbank in the dark. Other theories exist, of course. He could have fallen into an old, unmarked well or cistern on one of the area's many derelict farms. Or, as some speculate, he could have met with foul play. Perhaps his final curse was in reaction to seeing another person or a vehicle on that lonely road. But there has never been a shred of evidence to support this. The mystery of Brandon Swanson is so terrifying because of its simplicity. There were no monsters, no conspiracy. There was just a young man, lost in the dark, on the phone with his father, who took one wrong step. His parents' agonizing search led to a positive change. Frustrated by the initial delays in the official search, they championed a new piece of legislation. In 2009, Brandon's law was signed in Minnesota, requiring police to begin an immediate and thorough investigation into the disappearance of any adult, without the arbitrary waiting periods that were once common. It is a legacy born from an immeasurable loss, a loss that is made all the more haunting by that final, recorded moment. We know exactly where he was and what he was doing, and then in the space of a single second, he was gone. The mystery of the Antikythera mechanism. In the year 1901, a group of Greek sponge divers took shelter from a storm near the small rocky island of Antikythera. When the storm passed, they decided to dive in the uncharted waters and stumbled upon the find of a lifetime. A 2,000-year-old Roman-era shipwreck, its cargo of bronze statues, marble sculptures, and fine pottery scattered across the seabed. It was one of the greatest underwater archaeological discoveries ever made. But the greatest treasure brought to the surface that day was not a majestic statue, but a corroded, unassuming lump of bronze and wood, which was quickly set aside and almost forgotten. It was only later, when that lump broke apart, revealing the faint outline of a gear wheel, that the world got its first glimpse of an object that should not exist. This is the story of the Antikythera mechanism, an artifact so technologically advanced, so utterly out of place in its time, that it has been called the world's first analog computer. Its existence forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question: what knowledge has humanity lost to the ages? For decades after its discovery, the mechanism sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, a curiosity that no one could fully comprehend. Early analysis showed it was a complex clockwork device, but its purpose was a mystery. The real problem was its age. The shipwreck was dated to the 1st century BC, meaning the device was at least 2,100 years old. But the kind of intricate gear trains seen within it were thought to have been invented over 1,000 years later for the great astronomical clocks of medieval European cathedrals. Finding the Antikythera mechanism in a Roman shipwreck is like finding a perfectly machined steam engine in the tomb of a pharaoh. It's an anachronism, a piece of the future that somehow ended up in the distant past. The true breakthrough in understanding the device didn't come until the 21st century. Using advanced X-ray and CT scanning technology, an international team of scientists was able to peer inside the corroded fragments and digitally reconstruct the machine's inner workings. What they found was a work of breathtaking genius. The Antikythera mechanism was not a simple clock for telling time. It was a sophisticated astronomical calculator, a portable, hand-cranked model of the cosmos. Its bronze gears, at least 30 of them, were designed with a precision that would not be seen again for a millennium. The front of the device featured a large circular dial that showed the position of the sun and the moon against the constellations of the zodiac, as well as the 365-day Egyptian calendar. But the true genius was on the back. There, two large spiral dials tracked complex astronomical cycles. One followed the Metonic cycle, a 19-year period that reconciles the movements of the sun and moon, crucial for maintaining a lunar calendar. The other, the Saros dial, tracked a 2 to 3 month cycle that could be used to predict both solar and lunar eclipses with startling accuracy. It even had a smaller dial that tracked the 4-year cycle of the ancient Panhellenic Games, including the Olympics, indicating when the next games were to be held. Perhaps most astonishingly, the device contained a differential gear, a set of gears that can sum or subtract rotational inputs. This advanced piece of engineering, previously believed to have been invented in the 16th century, was used to accurately model the moon's variable speed, which appears to slow down and speed up in the sky due to its elliptical orbit. This level of astronomical and mechanical sophistication was simply not supposed to exist in the 2nd century BC. The mechanism has answered the question of what it was, but it has left us with even bigger, more haunting questions. First, who could have possibly built it? No artist or engineer signed their work. The leading theory points to the Greek island of Rhodes, which was a major center for astronomy and engineering at the time, possibly by the great astronomer Hipparchus, or perhaps in a workshop inspired by the legendary inventor Archimedes. The second and more profound question is, why is it the only one? An object of such complexity does not appear out of a vacuum. It must be the result of a long tradition of research and development. There must have been simpler versions, predecessors that taught the engineers how to master their craft. Yet, we have found none, and stranger still, it seems to have had no successors. The knowledge to build such a device appears to have vanished completely after its creation. What happened to this tradition of genius? Was it a closely guarded secret, lost when its creators died? Or was this knowledge wiped out in a cataclysmic event, like the burning of the Library of Alexandria, plunging the world into a technological dark age that lasted for 1,000 years? The Antikythera mechanism is a ghost. It's a tangible piece of a lost chapter in human history. It doesn't hint at aliens or magic, but at a level of human ingenuity that we once had and then forgot. It's a silent bronze testament to a forgotten world of ancient engineers who could chart the heavens, predict eclipses, and hold the complex dance of the cosmos in a small wooden box. The Mad Gasser of Matun. In the late summer of 1944, the world was at war. For the small town of Matun, Illinois, the war was a source of both patriotic pride and deep, gnawing anxiety. The headlines were filled with news from distant battles, and many of the town's sons were fighting overseas. But as August turned to September, a new and far stranger fear began to grip the community. A fear that came not from a foreign enemy, but from a shadowy figure who moved through their quiet streets at night, armed with a mysterious, sweet-smelling gas. The panic began on the night of August 31st, in the home of Aline Kearney, as she and her young daughter lay in bed. A strange, sickly sweet odor drifted into the room through the open window. Within minutes, Kearney felt a creeping paralysis take hold of her legs and arms. Terrified, she began to vomit. Her sister, who was also in the house, called for help. Aline's husband, a local taxi driver, returned home to find his wife in distress. He He ran outside just in time to see a tall figure dressed in dark clothing, running away from the house. The Kearney case was reported in the local newspaper, and the story acted like a spark in a dry field. Over the next 2 weeks, the town of Matun was consumed by a wave of terror. Dozens of similar attacks were reported across the community. The pattern was almost always the same. The victims, usually women at home, while their husbands were at work or at war, would smell the sweet odor. This would be followed by a frightening but temporary set of symptoms: nausea, a burning sensation in the throat, and a partial paralysis that would wear off after about half an hour. The mysterious assailant was given a name by the press: the Mad Gasser of Matun. He became a town-wide obsession, a phantom who could seemingly strike anywhere, at any time, without leaving a trace. Panic set in. Families sat guard on their porches with shotguns. Armed vigilante patrols, organized by worried citizens, roamed the streets at night, searching for any sign of the prowler. The local police force was completely overwhelmed, chasing down dozens of frantic calls a night, but always arriving too late. The investigation was a study in frustration. The gasser was a ghost. No one ever got a clear look at him. No footprints were ever consistently found. No gas delivery device, no canister, no sprayer was ever discovered. The only piece of potential physical evidence was a small cloth found on a porch, which a victim claimed the attacker had dropped, but it offered no real clues. Police briefly looked into a local chemistry student who was known to be eccentric, but there was absolutely no evidence to connect him to the events, and he was quickly cleared. Then, as suddenly as it began, the wave of attacks stopped. After a terrifying 2-week siege, the Mad Gasser of Matun vanished, never to be heard from again. He was never caught, never identified, and no one was ever seriously or permanently injured. And so, the central question remains: who or what was the Mad Gasser? One theory is that there was, in fact, a real, physical attacker, a disturbed individual, for reasons we can only guess at. Perhaps a perverse desire to create fear, or a twisted sense of scientific curiosity, was stalking the town with a homemade chemical agent. The sighting by Aline Kearney's husband is the strongest piece of evidence for this. But if the attacker was real, he was a criminal genius. To carry out dozens of attacks over a wide area without ever being seen clearly or leaving a single piece of incriminating evidence is almost unbelievable. This lack of evidence is what gives rise to the second, and now most widely accepted theory, that the Mad Gasser of Matun was not a man, but a phantom of mass hysteria. Consider the context. Matun in 1944 was a community under immense psychological stress. The anxieties of the war were a constant, daily pressure. Newspaper headlines were filled with stories of new and terrifying weapons, including Nazi experiments with nerve gas. The theory of mass psychogenic illness suggests that the first reported attack acted as a powerful, terrifying suggestion. In this view, after the Kearney story was published, other anxious residents began to misinterpret common household or environmental odors. The smell of nail polish remover, fumes from a nearby factory, or even just the scent of night-blooming flowers as an attack. Their fear then produced real physical symptoms. The paralysis, the nausea, the burning throat. These were not imagined. They were psychosomatic, the body's physical response to extreme anxiety. The Mad Gasser wasn't a person stalking their homes. He was a shared nightmare, a manifestation of the town's collective fear. A third theory acts as a middle ground, suggesting that an industrial pollutant, perhaps from a local factory, may have been the initial trigger. A real, irritating chemical in the air could have caused the initial symptoms in a few people, and then mass hysteria took over, amplifying and spreading the phenomenon across the entire community. In the end, we are left with an unsettling puzzle. Was Matun terrorized by a cunning phantom chemist, or by the power of its own fear? The Mad Gasser remains a fascinating and creepy case study in the nature of panic itself, A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monster is the one we can't see, the one that creeps in not through a window, but through our own minds. The wow signal. For as long as humanity has looked up at the night sky, we have asked ourselves a simple, profound, and unanswered question. Are we alone? It is a question that has driven religion, philosophy, and in the 20th century, a new branch of science. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI. It is a science of listening, of pointing massive radio telescopes at the heavens and sifting through the endless cosmic static for a single structured, unnatural signal. For decades, the search found nothing, and then for 72 seconds, on a summer night in 1977, that silence was broken. On the night of August 15th, 1977, Ohio State University's Big Ear radio telescope was doing what it always did, scanning the sky, its massive receiver, listening to the faint hiss of the universe. The data it collected was printed out on long sheets of paper as a seemingly endless string of numbers and letters. A few days later, an astronomer named Jerry Emmon was performing the routine and often tedious task of reviewing those printouts. As his eyes scanned the columns of data, he suddenly stopped. He saw a sequence of characters that made his heart race. Amidst the low-level noise of space, represented by the numbers 1 and 2, was a sudden massive spike in intensity, 6EAJ5. Oman stared at the printout, his mind racing. In the code used by the telescope, letters represented signal strengths greater than 9. The sequence he was looking at represented a signal that was not just strong, but astronomically powerful, peaking at over 30 times the intensity of the background noise of deep space. It was a perfect, structured crescendo. Stunned by what he was seeing, he grabbed a red pen, circled the sequence, and in the margin, he wrote a single emphatic word: wow. The wow signal, as it would forever be known, was not just remarkable for its strength. It had all the hallmarks of a potential extraterrestrial broadcast. First, it was a narrowband signal. Natural cosmic sources, like distant stars or pulsars, broadcast their energy across a wide range of frequencies, like a floodlight. The wow signal was a laser beam, transmitted on a very specific, narrow frequency. This is considered by scientists to be a primary indicator of an artificial, intelligently designed signal. Second, the frequency it was on was almost poetic. It was broadcast at 1420 MHz, a frequency known to astronomers as the hydrogen line. This is the specific frequency at which neutral hydrogen, the most abundant element in the entire universe, naturally emits radio waves. Scientists have long theorized that if an intelligent species wanted to send a message across the stars, they would choose this universal, fundamental frequency as a kind of cosmic meeting point, a channel that any developing civilization would eventually discover. Finally, the signal's duration and shape were a perfect match for an extraterrestrial source. It was audible for exactly 72 seconds. This was the precise length of time it would take for the Earth's rotation to sweep the Big Ear telescope's fixed view across a single point in the distant sky. The signal appeared, grew in intensity for 36 seconds, as the source moved into the center of the telescope's view, peaked, and then faded for 36 seconds. As it moved out, it was exactly the signature they had been looking for. The signal had come from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, from a patch of sky empty of any known sun-like stars. Astronomers were electrified. Had they finally found it? Was this the moment humanity learned it was not alone? They immediately pointed the Big Ear, and soon other, more powerful telescopes from around the world, back to that exact same spot, listening with breathless anticipation. And they heard nothing. That is the great, confounding mystery of the wow signal. It has never been heard again. For over 40 years, scientists have repeatedly and meticulously scanned that region of space. The silence has been absolute. It was a one-time only cosmic shout that has never been repeated. So, what was it? The most exhilarating possibility is that it was exactly what it appeared to be: a genuine, artificial signal from an intelligent alien civilization. Perhaps it was a powerful, sweeping beacon designed to announce their presence to the galaxy, and we just happened to be listening during the brief window. It passed over our planet, or maybe it was a targeted message that was only sent once. Over the years, scientists have proposed various natural explanations. In 2017, one theory suggested the signal could have been generated by the hydrogen cloud surrounding a passing comet. This idea, however, has been largely refuted by the original astronomy team, who noted that a comet would not produce a signal so powerful, so narrow, and with such a perfect rise and fall signature. Other theories suggest it could have been an Earth-based signal, reflecting off a piece of space debris, but the odds of that perfectly mimicking an interstellar broadcast are infinitesimally small. Perhaps the most plausible natural explanation is a phenomenon called interstellar scintillation, the same effect that makes stars appear to twinkle. A very faint but constant alien signal could have been momentarily and massively amplified by a cosmic lens of gas and dust between us and the source, making it appear incredibly powerful for a short time before it faded back into the background noise, too weak for us to hear again. But in the end, we are left with no certainties. The WOW signal remains the strongest, most compelling, and most mysterious candidate for an extraterrestrial broadcast ever recorded. Was it a cosmic fluke, a ghost in the machine, or was it a fleeting whisper from across the void, a brief hello from an unknown neighbor that we were lucky enough to overhear just once? It is the ultimate mystery, a single circled line of data that represents our deepest hope and our most profound uncertainty. We continue to listen, but the cosmos, for now, remains silent.